On WNIN Lawmakers this week, our guest is the senior senator from Indiana, Todd Young. We'll also get an update from the Indiana General Assembly. That's coming up next on WNIN Lawmakers. Welcome to the program. I'm John Gibson, morning edition host for WNIN FM. Before we speak with Senator Young, here's a quick update from Indianapolis. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports on the week at the State House.
The House passed a measure to create Indiana's first educational savings account program and expand the eligibility of taxpayer-funded private school vouchers. Under the expansion, families making double the state's median income would now be eligible for those vouchers. And voucher expansion would take up about a third of House Republicans' proposed increase in K-12 school funding in the next state budget. A bill passed by the Senate raises the penalty for rioting, which is when a protest becomes violent, to a felony if there's more than $750 worth of damage caused or if someone is seriously injured. And violating a curfew would now be a Class B misdemeanor, which can be punished with up to $1,000 in fines and 180 days in jail. But the Senate thoroughly rejected a measure that would have tied the hands of local governments from reducing their public safety budgets. The bill was a reaction to the defund the police movement. Only 9 senators voted in favor, 37 opposed it. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
Senator Young, thank you so much for joining us today. You're joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. It's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you, John.
Thank you, thank you. Well, let's begin with, what happened on January 6th. You were among the members of Congress at the Capitol when it was attacked. Can you tell us essentially your view on what happened that day?
Well, yes, it was an incredibly sad day for our country. The cathedral of our democracy, the United States Capitol, was assaulted by a bunch of criminals, and they, of course, over the course of storming the Capitol, they not only destroyed property, but they took lives from our brave police officers, and unfortunately, these individuals decided to try and overturn an election through force. We don't do that in this country. I'm really proud that collectively Republicans and Democrats came together that day to ensure that there was indeed a peaceful transition of power, that we returned to the Senate chamber and weren't intimidated from carrying on our longstanding responsibilities under the Constitution to ensure that the laws were faithfully executed. So a sad, sad day, one we should remember, right, and one that should never happen again.
Did you feel that you and your colleagues were in danger that day?
Of course, there was a danger to myself and to my colleagues, but for the heroic actions of a number of members of law enforcement, I might not be here speaking to you and to other Hoosiers today. So a very sad, sad day, and it reminds us that we can peacefully protest in this country. We can have strenuous disagreements. We can peacefully assemble, but when you start engaging in violence, we can never, ever allow that to happen.
Right.
And so we did not. In the end, our Constitution was protected, and each of us now should come together and make sure that we do our part to try and unify this country.
Senator Susan Collins said in a statement that you helped protect her and Senator Lisa Murkowski during the raid. Did your Marines training kick in on that day?
You know, it really did.
Yeah.
I first saw the Vice President of the United States ushered off of the dais of the United States Capitol there on the Senate chamber. I thought that he was being threatened personally, and my assumption was that somebody was in the gallery with a firearm. So I took a look up into the gallery, and then after that, once it became clear from the sergeant at arms that a number of these hooligans had penetrated the bounds of the Capitol, I was prepared for them to come into the chamber and threaten the lives and welfare of myself and my colleagues. And I certainly didn't do anything heroic by standing next to Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, but I was prepared to do what needed to be done.
Right. Well, after the riot, you were one of 43 Republican senators who voted to acquit former President Trump of inciting the deadly riot. Can you tell us why you voted to acquit?
Yeah, it was because there wasn't, as I explained in my fairly lengthy statement afterwards, there wasn't what we call due process. So it wasn't a fair procedure. You need to allow an investigation to occur, cross-examination of witnesses, all these sorts of things to happen. Otherwise, we're going to end up with an impeachment year after year after year. And that's the last thing we want to occur. So the people of Indiana want us to move on. They want us to focus on ensuring that their needs are met with respect to our COVID response, that our economy opens up again, that our children can go back to school very quickly. And it's important that we now turn our attention to that.
Now, do you fear, though, that this could set a precedent that maybe future presidents can pretty much do whatever they want in the final weeks of their term in office because there's not enough time to impeach and conduct a trial?
No, I actually think that my vote would uphold a long-standing precedent going back hundreds of years all the way to the signing of the Magna Carta, which requires that we actually have investigations and we have trials, fair trials, and so forth. I am concerned about the precedent of having purely sort of partisan votes as it relates to impeachment. You notice, despite the very strong jurisdictional arguments and arguments about having a fair process, there wasn't one Democrat, despite some of their legal training, who elected to join Republicans. Instead, they listened to, who knows, their leadership. It's tough to know the motivation of individual colleagues, but I respected my Republican colleagues who had principled disagreements with me, and I would have liked for some Democrats to show some courage and join Republicans in this effort.
One of your colleagues, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, said after voting to acquit that he felt that President Trump was, quote, practically and morally responsible for provoking the attack on the Capitol. Do you feel that way about President Trump? Did he, incite the riot?
Well, I've said it before, I've said it publicly, and I'm happy to say it again to you. Of course, the President of the United States has a measure of responsibility. He's the president. And therefore, much should be expected of our presidents, just as much should now be expected of now President Biden, someone who campaigned on the importance of unifying this country and on working in a bipartisan way to advance the agenda of the American people. He now needs to follow through with that. So, of course, there's a moral and a practical leadership responsibility that every president bears for their conduct.
All right, well, let's move on to the new president, President Biden. You and 9 other Senate Republican senators, that is, met with the president a few weeks ago to discuss the terms of the latest COVID relief package. What would you like to see in that package, and I guess what would you like to not see in that package?
Well, I want to focus on the immediate needs that stem from this COVID crisis. We passed 5 very bipartisan packages to deal with COVID relief last year. There was, in every instance, more than 90 Republicans and Democrats who came together This was during the Donald Trump era when there was a lot of criticism for the partisanship in Washington by members of the media and others, but 5 times we came together and passed responsible and targeted packages. The most recent package we passed and was signed into law was in late December. It was a $900 billion package. Much of that money has not been spent. So I am prepared to vote for a package, as are the other 9 Republicans who visited with President Biden, that puts needles in arms so that we can get everyone vaccinated, that gets our kids back to school as quickly and as safely as possible, following the science, as opposed to some other motivations people might have for keeping our children at home. And that allows each of our Hoosiers and other Americans to get back to work as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. That's what we should be focusing on. We should not be bailing out states for their profligate spending that occurred before the pandemic ever hit. We shouldn't be sending checks out to people who make $300,000 a year and haven't lost their job, which was part of the original proposal. And I look forward to working with this administration and hopefully Democrats in Congress to come up with a much slimmer package than the $1.9 trillion package they proposed. We've offered a counter proposal of roughly $600 billion.
Right, and well, you mentioned some things there. What are some of those deal breakers that you just can't vote for at this point?
Well, I can't vote to bail out New York or California or Illinois for the unkeepable promises that their elected officials have made to their constituents over the years that have put those states into a precarious financial position. I can't vote for a package that provides checks to United States senators who continue to get paid for their work and are in a financial situation that is not similar to those who've been put out of work for a long period of time and are really going through difficult circumstances. Instead, let's focus on people who need the help.
Right.
Let's focus on those Hoosiers who can barely make ends meet and are concerned about being able to pay their rent and feed their families. That should be the focus, as opposed to just throwing $1.9 trillion of our children and grandchildren's money, which is effectively what we're doing, borrow from the Chinese, and then pass the debts on to our children and grandchildren to pay for things that aren't needed. That's not why people sent me to Washington.
Does the package, as you say, borrow money from China? Exactly how do you see that happening?
It would borrow from China, that's right. Yeah, it does that because when you spend more than your government brings in revenue, you have to borrow the money. And among the countries we borrow from is the People's Republic of China, which of course, is building aircraft carriers and a blue water navy that will someday, on current course, challenge our ability to freely trade. It's a nuclear power that continues to grow their genocide. So, example of sort of debtor you don't want to edit.
I think we're having a little bit of trouble with your connection here right now, Senator. Let's see if we can get that cleared up. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Senator?
I can hear you. I see my face is frozen.
Okay, well now we've got you back, and it looks like things are rolling there. You mentioned the concerns about China. Going forward with the vaccine, however, we talked about the COVID-19 pandemic. The vaccines are out there. What are some of your concerns as the country moves forward with the vaccine rollout and getting the country opened back up more, including schools and businesses?
Well, before I get into concerns, and I will address that, John,
sure.
I want to commend our scientists, our frontline healthcare workers who are responsible, number one, for developing this vaccine, and then number two, for actually administering this vaccine. I mean, they're really the heroes here. This was facilitated, their development of the vaccine, quicker than we've ever seen before by some actions that I supported and that the previous administration implemented through Operation Warp Speed. It led to an expedited regulatory approval process. And though many people doubted we'd have vaccines produced by year's end, we were able to accomplish that.
Yeah.
So now we need to pivot to making sure we have as effective and efficient as possible manufacturing and distribution processes, which are largely the prerogatives of our state governments. Here in the state of Indiana, Governor Holcomb has just been doing excellent work in making sure that the vaccines that we have available get to the people who need it. But candidly, we need to ramp up production capacity, and that's something that the Biden administration is working with the pharmaceutical companies to ensure happens in fairly short order. So whatever resources are needed in order to ensure that that process goes smoothly and to ensure that we are procuring whatever vaccines can be produced in short order, I'm prepared to spend that money because that will allow us to open up our economy and resume our way of life as quickly as possible.
If we may ask, have you yourself had the vaccine yet at this point?
Yes. It was the CDC that recommended for continuity of government purposes that I and other senators and representatives receive a vaccination so that we could continue to represent our respective constituents, and they wouldn't be disenfranchised where we'll be required to isolate ourselves as I once had to do.
Right. Well, speaking of the vaccine, there are still a large chunk of the population out there who says that they don't want the vaccine. Perhaps they have some sort of issues or some sort of fears about the vaccine. What is your message to them? You mentioned the science is important, that we need to follow the science. What's your message to those folks who might be thinking they don't want to get the vaccine?
Well, a couple of messages. Number one, I do understand the apprehension. So many of our citizens have lost faith in various institutions and the leaders of those institutions over the years. And it's not just in government, it's in business and not-for-profits and members of the media. So it's really important that we're honest with our constituencies so that they listen to us when it's really important. But in this instance, I would just implore Hoosiers and other Americans to understand that this is not only about their own health. This is about the health of their neighbors and loved ones. Were someone not to become vaccinated and to be infected by this horrible novel coronavirus, then they could in turn infect those they love, their neighbors, and just perpetuate this current situation so that we can't open up our stores, we can't send our kids back to school on an ongoing basis, and we can't resume our way of life. So I think it's really important for not just elected officials, but all of our leaders to demonstrate leadership by getting vaccinated and encouraging others to do the same. And then, to the extent there are questions about those isolated cases where there are some adverse side effects, we also need to be honest about those. Otherwise, we undermine our credibility among those we represent.
Right. Well, as you probably know, much of the country has been socked by some severe winter weather in the past week or so. Here in the Hoosier State, we've seen quite a bit of snow, but Texas was completely or particularly hit hard, I should say. What are some of your thoughts on the situation there in Texas? They, as you may know, they have, I guess you might say, an aversion to federal regulations, and speak just in terms of the infrastructure, not just Texas but beyond Texas. How is our energy infrastructure, especially in light of a crisis like this?
Well, I've got a couple of reflections. We hail from a state which benefits and has historically benefited from bountiful natural resources. In fact, I believe you're questioning me from the southwestern part of our state. And as all the residents in the greater Evansville area know, that's coal country. And so that's a very reliable base load fuel source that we can depend on even during the most adverse moments, meaning when it's really hot or really cold and there are major draws on the electric grid. We can't depend in the same way on some of the renewable sources. So we don't want to go overboard with respect to solar panels and windmills until we figured out how to store all of that energy for long periods of time and get it to where it's needed for moments like this.
Yeah.
We're still studying the situation in Texas, so I want to be careful here, but some of the commentary, some of the readout and speculation is that the energy balance has not been right in Texas, that they've gone too far. Another lesson is when you're utilizing natural gas, as so much of Indiana does right now, you need to come up with mechanisms when the weather is really cold to ensure that that natural gas is usable. Otherwise, it doesn't move through the pipes properly. So that's an infrastructure need that we're going to have to keep in mind as we consider infrastructure legislation. And then the last thing that we'll have to consider, again, should we turn to a major infrastructure bill this Congress, is whether we move from localized and regional power grids, which is what we have now. You have a Midwestern power grid and a Northeastern United States power grid, and Texas has its own power grid.
Right.
We can move to a national power grid so that you can literally move power from geographies that have an excess of electricity production capacity, move it into geographies like, in this case, Texas, where there wasn't enough capacity. So instead, they made the decision to have rolling blackouts.
Right.
So this is a really unfortunate situation that has hit the poor and minority communities especially hard. But we can learn from this lesson and hopefully incorporate some of these lessons learned into future infrastructure initiatives.
So you'd rather see a national energy infrastructure instead of something like what Texas is doing, where they have essentially just their own, and if that system goes down, they can't borrow from their neighbors, right?
Possibly. I see some merit behind that. It's something I want to debate. There may be reasons why we want to have regional systems. So, for example, does it compromise a regional economy and the individuals that live within that geography? Should there be a problem with another region's grid? We need to explore questions like that before we finalize a decision about the best approach. But I absolutely think that this has opened up our eyes to that consideration. We're going to have to really decide which route we go as we work on this infrastructure bill.
All right, we have just a few minutes left here. Perhaps you could share with us some of the issues that you'd like to see addressed in this congressional session.
Well, there are a couple of things that are really top of mind for me. Number one is getting needles in arms, getting our kids back to school quickly and safely, and getting our workers back to work, again, quickly and safely, which is what all Hoosier workers want. The next thing is we need to supercharge our economy. We're already on pace for a high rate of economic growth this year on account of the tax reform and regulatory reform measures that we implemented just over the last couple of years. Let's go ahead and build on that through workforce development and some other initiatives, including some infrastructure build out like rural broadband, which is very important. And then lastly, we need to ensure that China is held to account for their many human rights violations and for their theft of our intellectual property and unfair trade practices, which steal Hoosier jobs and prevent Hoosiers from realizing the amount of prosperity that they would other be realizing. So you can count on me to hold China to account for all of their bad behavior.
One last question. Do you feel at this point that the tone has changed somewhat in Washington, D.C. with the new administration? Do you feel a different tone, maybe more optimism, maybe not? How would you describe it?
Well, that remains an open question. I had really candidly hoped that we would see not just a different tone, but that we would see actions that were consistent with the words we're hearing from President Biden. Biden has, I think, rightly emphasized the importance of coming together as a country. He delivered that message during his inaugural address. It was part of his campaign, and for the first, official step that he's taken in office, it was to pass a number of executive orders that are highly partisan, like eliminating the Keystone XL pipeline, for example. And then he followed that by dropping a $1.9 trillion package with a lot of partisan proposals in it onto the laps of members of Congress. So I want to give the president a chance to ensure that his words are met with actions and that we can come together for the good of the American people. That's certainly the spirit in which I will continue to approach my job.
All right, Senator Young, we certainly appreciate you joining us today on Lawmakers. Safe travels, and we hope to see you again soon. Next week on Lawmakers, our scheduled guest is Evansville Mayor Lloyd Winnecke. Thanks again to Senator Young. I'm John Gibson from WNIN FM. Thanks for joining us on WNIN Lawmakers.